Next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Parks rather than more profitable commercial and residential development. These are only three small examples of what I mean by government interference. Would the starter house be built if the builder could not sell it and move on to the next project? No. Would Copeland Lumber want to pursue a course that would not provide the greatest return for the development of their property? No. Could not an agreement be worked out with North Macadam property owners to maximize the value of all of their properties with the distribution of the burden of parks shared by all? You will not find these conclusions in the report. It gives greater weight to the prevalent direction of government interference at the expense of the pioneering legacy that gave the Pacific Northwest the financial strength that it has today. The minority urges you to vote to accept that part of the report that makes approval of projects easier, Part D, and reject the remainder of the recommendations. With your vote, we can send a message to City Hall. We want to see the free market prevail in developing our city for the next future, at the next century. I hope that in 2017 we can look back on our city and feel it is as good as most and better than some. Thank you.
Make a motion.
The motion is to accept Part D and reject the rest of the report.
First, before we debate on that motion, and I think you've got on one side those for it and those against it, and if you would line up, we're going to be debating the motion that you've just heard. Before that, I would ask, are there any questions that anyone in the audience would like to have of the committee itself? Okay. Yes.
I guess this is, am I on?
Yes.
I guess this is the point to ask a question. I'm Don Sterling, a member of the club. And I asked this question with the background of having been a member of the Citizen Advisory Committee for the Southwest Community. Come to fruition. One of the reasons that the Southwest Community Plan the discovery of the inferior infrastructure in Southwest Portland, lack of sidewalks, lack of paved streets, lack of adequate storm sewers, and other such matters which prevent increased density until you can deal with the consequences of density. Now, I don't see much reference to that in this report. I'm quite sure the committee must have considered it, and perhaps I simply missed it, but my question is, where have you dealt with the city's infrastructure problems?
Don, that's a good question, and there are actually a lot of issues which we didn't deal with frontally because of the complexity of this issue. I think the main area in which we dealt with that is in considering how the commission form of government adversely affects planning. And what we saw was a system which, whoever the commissioners are, the system leads each commissioner to prize developments in their area of expertise, and as a result, infrastructure development does not happen in a coordinated fashion. And so we have, one of our strongest recommendations is that planning for all of the agencies of the City of Portland be unified in one area so that infrastructure and transportation and other sorts of needs would be coordinated with housing planning.
One more general question. Okay. I'll have first those who are in favor of the motion, which is to the minority report.
I thought we were voting. Are we not? I'm not in favor of the minority. Is that what you're?
So you should line up over there. Is there anyone that wishes to speak in favor of the minority report? Those against? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Chris Smith. I'm a member of the Density Study Committee. I would like to speak against the minority report with due respect to my late colleague and to Kurt's excellent presentation of his point of view. And really, I come at this from observation of what the market has produced and what the market has failed to produce. What we've seen market forces produce is dramatic underbuild within the urban growth boundary, so that we see those single-family houses out at the edge of the UGB rather than seeing true communities, which is what the market has failed to produce. The market doesn't produce neighborhoods. We see that one of the distinct attractors in the Portland area is the neighborhoods that were produced in the pre-automobile era, and we have not seen market forces today produce those same kind of neighborhoods and communities that seem to be such a great attractor here in Portland. One of the things that the committee looked at was the whole issue of competency in the field of urban design within Portland's planning department, and we found that to be somewhat deficient. And I think that it's only through layering good urban design on top of market forces that we will get the kind of communities that we want to build here in the Portland area. Thank you.
I guess I think that the final line kind of speaks for itself. I mean, it seems like such an unlofty goal to be as good as most and better than some, you know, and I think that this is, the whole issue is really having a long-term vision and stepping back and getting away from just the small little planning things that are important, but creating a vision again so that we you know, have wonderful results rather than just mediocre results.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak for or against the motion? Then I'll call for the question. Those are in favor of the motion, which is to accept the minority report, please raise your cards. Those opposed? You can't vote twice, but the nays have it. The minority report is rejected. We will now debate the majority recommendation. Are there those who wish to speak for it? Those who wish to speak against it? Well, here we are. All right.
In favor of the report, I am B.J. Seymour, City Club member, and a longtime member of the Downtown Community Association, which is the neighborhood organization for people who live downtown. And I think DCA feels very strongly, and I personally feel strongly, that planning is important. Downtown is the one area so far that welcomes density. We're not saying not in our backyard. We're saying downtown is where density should be, and I think the report makes that clear. I wonder a little bit why there was no mention of the Blitz-Weinhard property, which is downtown and is potentially another area for development. But I certainly favor acceptance of the report despite that, and congratulate the committee on one of the most appealing reports I've ever seen from the City Club, with all the pictures particularly. This was an outstanding report.
Could I just respond?
Yes.
One reason we didn't mention the Blitz property is that if we had published the report when we meant to, then the Blitz property would not yet have been on the market. But it's actually a perfect example of the type of site that we feel is most attractive.
Is there anyone who wishes to speak against the report?
Yeah, Jim Zarin, City Club member. I'm not literally going to speak against it because I'm not going to vote against it. As a former research board chair and study committee chair, I'm loath to do that, but I'm going to abstain. And the reason I'm going to abstain is that although I have very little difficulty with what's in here, I do have difficulty with what's not in here. And one of the things I think that's not in here that's so important is more indication of the good things that we are doing in Portland. I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff we are doing on this issue that's very good and very important. As someone said to me, when you read this, you think we were Houston. And we're not Houston, and I think the committee has gone overboard in that respect. The other thing that I think is important is it relates to the issue that was already raised by Don Sterling, and that's the lack of the reports addressing the relationship between density on one hand and infrastructure on the other. Seems to me some of the most important aspects of achieving density has to do with the transportation system, especially transit, and the streetscape. The report talks about streetscape, but it talks about it in relation to how dwellings meet the street, as opposed to parks, street trees, park benches, all the good stuff that make density work. We have that in Portland in places. We know it in downtown. There are places where it works well. I think we should have talked more about that in the report. And also our ability or inability to fund that stuff in the future will play as big a role as anything in how well we're doing it on density. The streetcar system that many of you may have seen under construction when you came over here in light rail is going to do more for density than many of these policies ever would. It's not mentioned at all in here. So on those two bases, I think the report has some serious shortcomings. My biggest fear is that the committee really reported what it heard. And that means that people in the community are not thinking about these things. And I think that's a real concern of all of us. Thanks.
I'm Ray Lonnie, a City Club member. I have to echo completely what Jim Zarin said. It's exactly the way I feel. And I'm just going to add a few things. I don't know, I came here certainly not prepared to vote for a minority. I was reasonably comfortable with a majority, except for what Jim mentioned. And I think Jim offered me an alternative, which is abstaining. And I may end up doing that. My concern is that without paying much more attention to alternative transportation, and by that I mean principally transit, I don't see how we can accommodate greater density, which is something we will have to do. Population increase, natural population increase, immigration, Oregon and Portland livability and appeal not only to the country but to the whole world is assuring that we will have more people. And so I will just again say we got to pay attention to alternative transportation, to transit much, much more. I call your attention to the excellent maps facing page 52, and it's a graphic illustration of how this this area developed BA before the automobile and AA after the automobile. Thank you.
I don't know whether Ray was speaking for or against or neutral, so I'll ask for now a proponent.
Yes, I'm Don Wagner, member, and I'm speaking very strongly in favor of the issues that have been raised and the direction. And this is really not trying to say this is exactly what should be done, but this is the process. So I think the planning and leadership to revitalize the city planning by making long-term planning a funding priority, that's great, ought to be done. City should create a land development strategy for meeting its year-by-year growth goals so you kind of know where you are. That's cool. And so I think rather than trying to get into a lot of specifics, we're hoping that the city, or they're hoping, and I support their work, that the city make their strategy establishment firmer and having a better direction. So I urge a yes vote.
Okay. Ken Duker, member. I chaired the charge writing committee for this study during my term on the research board. My term ended, however, in June, so I've not seen drafts of the report. I'm pleased on one hand with the comprehensiveness and thoroughness of the report, but I have a major concern. Both the city and the committee acknowledge that the goal is accommodating growth in Portland, but the fixation on density shifts the goal to one of increasing density. Both city policy and the City Club report fall into the same trap. The goal should not be to increase density. Density is in most instances an undesirable outcome of development, policies and programs that need to be mitigated through good design or provision of infrastructure such as pedestrian and transit facilities and traffic calming features. Implicitly, the City Club report assumes density will bring vitality to the city and help the region in curbing urban sprawl. Thus, density becomes the overriding goal, and the report merely quibbles about the means, large rather than small projects. In addition, the report largely accepts the city's command and control approach to densification. The report fails to recognize several problems with the city's densification policies. These problems are: one, build it, but they may not come. Density that the market finds attractive may not be absorbed. Densification is a natural result of a strong market, as in Northwest Portland. But it is not possible to impose density where market conditions for it are not strong enough. It will be quite difficult to achieve the density goals in other areas such as St. John's and Gateway. Two, the call for a year-by-year goal for population growth presumes that consumer choices will follow city policy and plans. Instead, the policies and programs need to be adjusted to reflect consumer preferences and choices. Planning to accommodate 20% or 29% of the region's growth is overly ambitious given past trends. Three, and finally, regulation in the form of minimum development densities, investments in the form of costly renewal and transit projects, and incentives in the form of tax abatements may be less effective in promoting the quantity and quality of development than in investing in good government, quality schools, and other things to make the city an attractive place to live. The densification policies may prove to detract from attracting development. Although I'm not going to move, I would urge, if this motion does not pass, to defer action on the report to allow redrafting and conclusions and to the recommendations. Density is an outcome, not a goal. Thank you.
Anne Marie Claire, City Club member and committee member on this density report. One of the things I've noticed in a couple of comments lately, the gentleman before me, as well as a comment from Commissioner Hales in the newspaper yesterday, was that the committee is accused of having a density agenda. Our committee was formed on the basis that we were supposed to look at the density programs that were going on in Portland, the density tools, and evaluate their effectiveness. As we heard testimony over a 1.5 year period of time, we heard many issues that came up, and that's when we decided that we were going to try to have another view about how density is done in the city rather than just implementing the policies that are out there. Among those ideas, we discovered that, of course, density is a contentious issue in terms of infill in the smaller single-site issues. Therefore, we recommended that we should use medium and large sites to try to capture the greatest number of units for density. We also discovered that citizen groups were feeling that the citizen process was not working effectively for them, and that we recommended, another one of our strong recommendations is that citizen groups, neighborhood groups, be given a stronger role in the policy development stage rather than at the tail end at the site review stage. The other idea that we had was whether or not we did not attack transportation issues because we knew that would spiral our report off in another direction and not do it justice. But we are recommending that a further report be done, analyzing parking, transportation, traffic patterns, all that sort of thing, and the impact that density does with that. We've discovered that long-range planning was not being addressed very well in the city, that functional planning, permit planning, helping the developers was being addressed with Blueprint 2000 and the subsequent reorganization of the Bureau, and we applaud that. But we still take a strong stand that we need vision in this city. We need a long-range planning director under the mayor so that it will have a sense of leadership over the council. Thank you very much.
In the interest of time and the fact that we have a speaker here as well, I'm going to, at this point, if I may, call for a vote on the motion that's been made before us. You've heard the motion before, which is to accept the majority report and adopt the City Club report. Those in favor, please raise your card. Those opposed? Those abstaining? The majority votes aye. Thank you very much to you, members of the committee, for the hard work you've done, and nicely done. The report, in addition to being available in the office, will be available on a website shortly. I'm Lloyd Anderson, President of City Club, and welcome to our program today, over and above this density report. Today we look at Oregon's labor market and its effect on the state's economy with State Commissioner of Labor and Industries, Jack Roberts. On Friday, November the 12th, join us for a report on the state of Oregon's courts with Wally Carson, Chief Justice of Oregon's Supreme Court. It'll be here at the Multnomah Athletic Club. The Growth Management and Environment Committee and the Portland Bureau of Environmental Services are coordinating a tour of sites relevant to the endangered fish in Portland on Saturday, November the 13th. If you'd like to go on this trip, reservations are required. Please call Winnie and make the arrangements. I'd like to call on Harriet Watson briefly for our annual report comments. Harriet? There you are.
First, I'd like to thank Ted for his unsolicited advertisement for the annual fund. I too can think of no activity that better embodies the club's vitality and mission than the report on density and the discussion it's provoked. To date, we're almost midway through the $100,000 annual fund campaign. We have received commitments totaling approximately $51,000. To that end, on behalf of the Board of Governors, I'd like to thank those who have already given and to encourage others, members and non-members alike, to give at a level commensurate with your ability and with the value you place on the contribution that City Club makes to the city and the region. A $100 gift, for example, is less than $2 a week. And this year, all new gifts of $25 or more will be matched dollar for dollar by the President's Challenge. Pledge cards are on the side table, and we will gladly accept your contributions and pledges today. All of us face increasingly tough choices about how we spend our time and our dollars. And I want to personally thank all of you for making the City Club a priority in your giving and for your active stewardship of this important civic institution. I'd especially like to thank Ted and his committee for not appending a log of would-be billable hours to the report.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Our board host seated at the table today is Les Swanson, member of the Board of Governors and an attorney in private practice. He will ask the first question. Following Les's questions, we can ask questions from the floor, and in addition, if you have questions you'd like to write down and have a staff member bring up here, we will attempt to respond to those within the time limits we have. Broadcasts of City Club programs this quarter are made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Providence Health Plans, U.S. Bank, and Washington Mutual Savings Bank. We're grateful for their support. In doing my family history, I found the name Roberts rather prominent a few generations back. They had big families and evidently headed for the pulpit as preachers or politicians. Here in Oregon, the name Roberts has been magic in politics for decades. Statewide in 1994, the voters had an opportunity and chose a new Roberts in a Roberts versus Roberts race for Commissioner of the Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries. At the time, the race was partisan, and generally it was felt a shoe-in for the incumbent Democrat. But Jack Roberts won, no landslide, but by over 20,000 votes. And 4 years later, after the position was made nonpartisan, he won handily. The Bureau administers state laws relating to civil rights, employment, and apprenticeships. At a time when industry is more and more going worldwide and affirmative action is under attack and the need for more and more skilled workers, The job is a big challenge. Prior to his job as commissioner, Jack was appointed and then elected twice to the Lane County Board of Commissioners in the early 1990s, after practicing law for 10 years. He's a graduate of the University of Oregon and its law school and received a master's in law and taxation from New York University. Jack, during the time he's been in office, has reduced his staff by over 20%. He's improved the family leave law and extended coverage to more than 100,000 additional workers. One of his main priorities during his tenure has been improvement in Oregon's child labor laws. We're honored to have Commissioner Jack Roberts as our speaker. Jack?
Thank you. Appreciate the chance to be with you today. I also enjoyed very much listening to that discussion, having been a county commissioner and dealing with planning issues in Eugene, where we are behind what's happening up here, but on the same track. It's interesting to see how you're grappling to deal with those issues, because we've been doing the same thing. It's always nice also to be reminded of kind of the path that I took to get to this job. I know there were a lot of people who were surprised when I won in 1994. I'll be honest with you, I was probably one of the ones who was surprised, but it was interesting in the race because at the time, of course, we didn't have term limits on this job, and I was running against a 4-term incumbent, and I thought, boy, I can use this somehow in the campaign. That must be the record. What I found out is that after this office was created, back at the beginning of this century, in 1901, we've only had, I'm the 7th person to hold this job. And although she had been in office for 4 terms, she was tied for 3rd in the list of longevity of the 6 people who had held the job to that point. In fact, I think today the only record she holds, I think she may have been the only one to leave the office alive, because the rest of them seemed like they just stayed there until they were gone. My goal is to be the 2nd, but it has been interesting. We were able to change this from being a partisan to a nonpartisan position. I thought that was a step in the right direction. We also, 2 sessions ago, tried to get a bill to make it unelected, an appointed job. And that failed because I think with term limits now affecting the legislature, they wanted to make sure they had plenty of jobs they could run for when they're through. But it's been my feeling that these jobs that are administrative in scope, like this one, like the superintendent of public instruction, really ought to be appointed. And often when I go talk to groups and I make that point during the question and answer, a lot of people ask, why would we do that? Don't we lose the accountability? Can't we hold you more accountable if we elect you? And oh, by the way, what does your job do anyway? And so it seems to me that on these types of positions, the best way to have that accountability is to have the person answering to someone like the governor and let the governor stand or fall on his or her record as how they appoint people and how they deal with the job. And that's how I think we can make this work better. But as long as we elect it, then it seems to me that our responsibility as elected officials is not simply to run our agency, but also to perhaps give a broader vision for the electorate in terms of where we're going. And in that situation, I think this job is unique because I'm the only one of the 6 statewide elected officials who deals primarily with the private sector. All of the other jobs have to do with making government work better, investing public money, or overseeing elections, dealing with public schools, or being, in the case of the Attorney General, the lawyer for the state. And the governor oversees the entire executive branch. Our job is a regulatory agency, dealing with enforcing wage and hour laws, enforcing civil rights laws, overseeing apprenticeship programs. We deal more with the private sector than with the public sector. And so it seems to me that in this job, in addition to trying to enforce those laws and protect it, there's also a responsibility to talk about how we are doing as a state and how our economy is performing in particular. And a lot of your discussion that you had earlier today is a reflection of the effects of that growth, of that strong economy that we've had, and how we deal with it, how we mitigate it, how we manage it. But it does seem to me that having grown up here and having seen the ups and downs of our economy, we have recently experienced the most prolonged and consistent economic growth as a state in my memory, and I think really in our history. I always have to add to that this prosperity is not shared evenly by everyone in our state. It is not shared throughout the entire state, and having in the last few months been to Baker City and LeGrand, to Klamath Falls and Central Point, to Coos Bay and Lincoln City, I can tell you that not everyone's participating in this. And not all sectors of our economy are participating. But when you put it all together, we have had a tremendous run of prosperity as a state. And I think it's important that we stop maybe sometimes and think about why has that happened? What do we need to do to maintain, to expand, to extend that prosperity? And how do we make sure that as a state, we use it wisely? And that's particularly true today because I think there are some competing theories about why we're enjoying the prosperity that we are. One of the ones that's very prominent today is the notion that we are succeeding because we have a great quality of life, because we have a wonderful natural environment, and everyone wants to come here. And in fact, 2 sessions ago, when the governor submitted his budget to the legislature, he said that we are very fortunate that we made some wise decisions back in the 1970s to preserve our quality of life, and because we did that, because we passed things like LCDC and the bottle bill, today we are prospering as a state. And I remember those days, and I remember those decisions, and I, having grown up here, certainly am second to none in appreciating our quality of life. That's why I'm raising my family here. That's why I want to live here. I think all of us do. But I also remember that after we made those decisions, and when we still had a great quality of life, in the early 1980s, our economy went in the toilet. We were losing jobs. We were losing population. People were leaving Oregon to find jobs, leaving this wonderful place to live and going to places that maybe weren't so wonderful, but places where they can make a living. And that we have turned that around without appreciably improving our quality of life. And if anything, in many respects, that quality of life that we have today, absent the economy, is not always as nice as it was 15, 20, 25 years ago. What changed? What happened? Well, I think government has played a role. But I think it's about some decisions that we've made since the mid-'80s, and not just the decisions that we made in the 70s. And I'd like to review some of those with you. In the 1980s, we were facing a terrible recession, and we were seeing a threat to many of our most basic industries. And the rest of the country was also going through some changes. And one of the things that was at issue was our tax structure. I mean, in Oregon, it's always at issue. But in particular, there was a fairly obscure part of our law, how we taxed out-of-state and out-of-country businesses coming here. We used something called a unitary tax, which basically said if you want to come here and go to work, or you want to open a business here, we want you to open up your books and records, let us look at your worldwide income, and then decide by our formula how much of that we're going to tax here in Oregon. We were like most states in that regard. And for many years that worked fine because most multinational companies were American, and they had to play by our rules. But suddenly in the 1980s, we were facing large companies, particularly in the Pacific Rim, that didn't come from here and didn't have to come here at all. And if they wanted to come here, we needed to have rules that they could live with. And so state after state started changing that and repealing their unitary tax. And when California repealed theirs, the question to Oregon was, are we going to be competitive, or are we going to stick with our old way of doing business? And in 1984, when we had a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature, they came together and said, we need to get in the game. We need to be able to compete. And so they came together in 1984, a one-day special session. And imagine, if you can today, trying to get the governor and the legislature to agree to anything in 1 year, much less one day. They came together in a one-day special session on a bipartisan basis and repealed Oregon's unitary tax. It was not without controversy. And there were people who said, this is a windfall for big business. There's no guarantee anyone's going to come here. We shouldn't be doing it. But across party lines, people decided this is worthwhile for us to do. They did it. And since that time, we have had billions of dollars invested in the state. In fact, during 1 year early in this decade, we had more foreign investment in Oregon than the total amount of foreign investment in China. And because we had that, we were able to diversify our economy, and it helped lay the groundwork for the economic growth we've had. Now, we did something else. In 1990, when we had a Democratic governor, a Democratic legislature, but control was fairly narrowly divided, and we had a governor, Neil Goldschmidt, who reached out to Democrats and Republicans, and more importantly, reached out to business and labor and said, we have a problem. We have some of the highest workers' compensation rates in the country. Whenever they do a survey of some business group or some magazine, they would look at where's a good place to do business, where's a bad place to do business. One of the things they always identified as a problem with Oregon is our high workers' compensation rates. And Neil Goldschmidt brought Democrats, Republicans, business and labor together in what was then called the Mahonia Hall Conference after what was at that time a new governor's mansion. Brought people together as only Neil Goldschmidt can do, and wouldn't let them leave until they came up with a deal. And they reformed the workers' compensation system. And every year since then, our workers' compensation rates have declined. We today have some of the lowest workers' compensation rates in the country. And every time a magazine or a group starts to survey good places to do business, bad places to do business, one of the positive aspects of doing business in Oregon is our workers' compensation rates. And yet in reforming that system, streamlining it, they actually increased the benefits for injured workers and made the system work better. We've done some other things. In the 1980s, we adopted rules relating to enterprise zones. In the 1990s, something called Strategic Investment Plan. These were tools that local governments may use, or not required to use, but may use to provide tax incentives, tax breaks to businesses who invest. This continues to be very controversial. And the controversy crosses party lines and ideological lines. Many liberals, many Democrats say, gee, this is a windfall for business. We're attracting too many businesses. We're doing that. Many conservatives say you're distorting the marketplace. And particularly small business owners say, I've been here working all my life. I've been paying the full board. Nobody's giving me a break. Why are you doing that? And yet, in a sense, when you stop and look at what's happened, it is, I think, a reaction to the tax system that we have in this state. Because compared to our neighboring states, Oregon taxes the means of production, labor, plant, and equipment, more than our neighbors, because we have a high income tax, and we have historically had, and even today still, compared to many, have a high property tax. We tax our own consumption less because we don't have a sales tax, and Oregon voters have made it pretty clear that they like it that way. Nonetheless, when you're looking at making a major investment in a capital-intensive industry that creates manufacturing jobs, and particularly what we're seeing is in the high-tech industry, that is a tremendous value added that if it is taxed under our normal system, can for many of them be prohibitively expensive. Particularly high-tech, where you're talking about $1 billion or more for a single plant. 80% of it, or more in some cases, is equipment. It's not the physical structure. It's very, very expensive, very sophisticated equipment that becomes obsolete, often in 3 to 5 years. And yet if you're making an $800 million investment in equipment, and have to pay 1.5%, which under Measure 5, it's down to 1.5%, but it's still 1.5% every year for the privilege of doing business in Oregon, it's often difficult to pencil that out. And so we've developed tools that allow local governments to decide we're going to give you an abatement, or in the case of the Strategic Investment Plan, we're going to allow you to only add $100 million to the local property tax base. We'll get that money, which we wouldn't get at all if you didn't come here, and you'll get a break so that you can afford to come here. And again, it's been controversial, but the record is that we have attracted an awful lot of businesses and particularly diversified our economy away from the resource-based industries that have been our mainstay for decades. And we've done that through tools that have been made available by government. And finally, government broadly defined, government as we the people voting in the initiative process, did something else. We cut our property taxes. We passed Measure 5, Measure 47, Measure 50. Now I have to tell you, having been a tax lawyer before I got into this business, I certainly wouldn't have written those measures the way they were written. And I'll be honest with you and tell you, I didn't vote for any of them. I voted for Measure 50 after 47 passed, but that doesn't count. I don't think that was necessarily the right way to deal with it, but I also have to be honest with you and tell you, we didn't have an alternative on the ballot for people to say, this is how I'm going to stop from being taxed out of my home. And that people looked at property tax and what were happening, they said, enough is enough, we need to stop it. And since those have passed, we have had a lot of implications, but you can't argue that our economy has declined since that time. So if you look at all those things that I've described as a package, what's the common thread that runs through them? It's that all of them reduce the cost of doing business in the state. All of them lower the cost of living and working and investing in Oregon. And that has been the keystone of our economic growth and our economic prosperity. Well, what's the lesson that we should draw from that? It is that I think we should be very cautious about how we change those fundamentals. And we ought to think very carefully about the decisions that we make in the years ahead if we want to continue the prosperity that we're enjoying. There are those who now are saying that it's great that we have this prosperity. We think it's because it's a wonderful place to live. And the only thing wrong with Oregon now is that the government doesn't have enough money and business isn't paying its fair share. And I would suggest to you that that is a very dangerous assumption to make. First of all, we have as much money as we have in government today, in part because our economy is so strong. Secondly, if we change that, and if we push the pendulum too far the other direction, we may find that we don't produce more revenue as a state in total, we produce less. Does that mean we can't change our tax structure at all? Of course not. Does that mean that we shouldn't review what we're doing and decide how we do? Of course it doesn't mean that. But it means we need to understand in the broader context how our tax structure, how our regulatory structure, how our government interrelates with the rest of our economy as well as with our society. And I think that's what the governor discovered this last year as he looked at ways to change the tax structure, which he had been saying he wanted to do and it appeared he wanted to do. But when he got into it and looked at it, whether because of the policy analysis or frankly because of the political analysis, he decided that the changes that he originally wanted to make couldn't be made. And I don't think that that was a mistake. I think that it was an awakening on his part of really what is involved in keeping Oregon going. I think that Oregon has a great opportunity to build on this prosperity. And I'm one of the lucky ones because I did grow up here. I do still live in Eugene. I was able to grow up in Eugene. I went from grade school through law school without ever leaving Eugene. I started a business. It was a law practice, so it was almost a business. I started a family, got married, started a family, bought a home, all in Eugene. And today I get to go up and down I-5 going to my various offices from Eugene. And that's important. Today my kids attend the same public schools in Eugene that I attended. And when they grow up, they'll make a decision as to what they want to do. And they may decide they want to go someplace else, and being kids, they'll do what they want to do. What I want to know is that if they want to do the same thing that I did, if they want to stay in Eugene, find a job, start a business, start a family, buy a home, will they be able to do that? Will your kids, your grandkids, be able to stay here and enjoy this quality of life? And I would suggest to you that that will depend on whether we manage our growth properly, we maintain our resources, but also do we keep an economy that is growing, that is producing jobs, that is producing an opportunity to make a living. I knew too many people whose kids came of age during the early 80s, who had to leave to find work, in many cases developed a new home, developed a new community, and they never came back. I want to make sure that we have the opportunity in this state to build a better future for our children and our grandchildren. If we do that, I believe Oregon's best days are still ahead of us. If we fail to do that, then I think someday we'll have to explain to our children and to our grandchildren how we let this opportunity slip by. Those are the considerations, together with the planning considerations and other things that you talked about today, that I think need to inform our debate in the coming years and in the coming decades. I think that Oregon, to be the state we want it to be, not only has to preserve our physical, our natural environment, but also our business climate and our economic environment. And I think that by doing that, we are being the best stewards, not only of our land, but of our people. Thank you.
Commissioner Roberts, in a recent guest editorial in the Oregonian, you commented on the Portland School Board's ban on military recruiters in Portland high schools. The school board ban is because the military discriminates against gays and lesbians with the military's don't ask, don't tell policy. You say in your editorial that, quote, one of the pitfalls of an elected school board is that political correctness too often takes precedence over education. My question, it will come, is what do you say to an openly gay young man at Cleveland High School who would like a career in the Marine Corps to follow his father and his grandfather, but cannot enter the Marine Corps and live openly and honestly as a gay man? Should he and the school board who represent his interests take a stand on principle? If you won't take our finest because he is gay, you won't be here recruiting others. Or should they recognize that this is a national policy and that their local protest is just a leaf in the wind, and that the ban prevents recruiters from coming to schools to meet interested heterosexual students? If your answer is, as you said in the editorial, that Portland's tail is not going to wag the national dog on this issue, then how does that square with a long and honorable position of the Republican Party that local governments and state governments, including school boards, should be active policymakers, closer to the people, and not be swamped by the larger waves of the federal government in Washington, D.C.? And, second question, is it better education to surrender to a discriminatory national policy, or is it better education to let all students know that there will be a fight, however small and local it may be, to protect the rights of all students, including those in a minority group?
Yes or no? Yes. Let me expand that a little bit, and I will try to keep this briefer than the question, but first of all, what do I say to an openly gay person who wants to be in the military? That the military rules currently don't allow that. And the Portland School District doesn't make that decision. We don't make that decision. That's made by the President and Congress, and that's where they are today. And I don't necessarily support that decision, and I have a record of supporting non-discrimination. I was, I believe, the only statewide elected official who testified in favor of the Economic Non-Discrimination Act when it was before the legislature in '97. I was proud to do that. Our agency enforces the Portland ordinance against sexual orientation discrimination, as we do the ordinances in Corvallis, Benton County, and in Eugene. But we're not going to change that rule here in Oregon. And I think if people want to protest that, they can. The problem is this is not just a protest. This is an affirmative action to deny kids in school who would be eligible to serve in the military information about that. I think it's unfortunate that today the Portland School Board is considering banning all recruiters other than for colleges, because that is totally inconsistent with what our education reform effort is supposed to be, which is making sure that schools are about connecting people to their future opportunities, even if they don't go to college, and that other post-secondary education, post-secondary opportunities ought to be available. That ought to be available to our students. And as someone who's concerned about having a trained workforce, having an educated workforce, giving kids opportunities, I think that we are denying them that for what is a symbolic protest that is not going to change the military policy. And I think that whatever we want to do to make our own views known is appropriate. I don't think that it's appropriate for us to deny kids the very real opportunities that the military presents for many of them. Yes.
Andy Linehan, City Club member. In your discussion of the factors that are contributing to Oregon's current prosperity, I was really quite astonished that you didn't talk at all about the role of the national economy. And I think traditionally Oregon's economy has perhaps tracked national trends but has amplified them somewhat. And I've recently seen that our unemployment rate is inched above the national rate. I guess I'd like you to talk about to what degree Oregon's economy has become more or less linked to the national trends, and to what degree government policy has really played a role in delinking us, giving us some independent ability to grow.
Certainly our relation to the national and to the international economy is very important. What I was trying to do is concentrate on steps that we have taken as a state, but I think that your point is a good one. I'm not sure I'd say that our unemployment has inched above the national. We're at 5.8%, the national is at 4.2%. So I think it's something we ought to think about. Part of the reason is that we are a magnet drawing a lot of people here, and so even though jobs continue to grow, they're not growing as fast as people or job applicants. The other thing that I would encourage people to stop and think about is maybe, just maybe, this is related to the fact that 3 years ago Oregon voters decided to raise Oregon's minimum wage to the highest in the country, and that's made it difficult for many people, at least in the starting low-skilled job, to get those opportunities. Nonetheless, are we more linked or less linked? I think to the extent that our employment in particular, and actually our economy in general, is less reliant on timber and wood products, which was always a lead indicator for the economy. When the economy went bad, housing starts fell off, we were always the first ones to catch that. So we're a little more decoupled than we were before. And we saw that in the early 90s when we were not hurt as bad by the national recession as historically we have been. We may be more susceptible to what's going on across the seas in the Pacific Rim, and what's happened with the so-called Asian flu has had an impact on us there as well. But I think that the more we diversify our economy, the more we will be able to withstand some of those the buffeting, whether from abroad or internally. And I think that that's one of the things we have to continue to look at.
Ray Polani, City Club. We have a written question next, and then you.
Is that shorter than yours?
Yes, it is. So, shorter than mine. This question is a recent Oregonian story reported that the state had made an administrative decision to warn employers rather than to fine them? In light of the fact that the federal government moved to issue $31,050 in fines against 6 growers for illegally employing children under 12 in the fields, do you believe you have done an adequate job policing the use of child labor in agriculture? And can you discuss the state's decision to warn rather than to assess fines?
Yes, I can. It's always been our policy that if the feds fine, we don't come in and fine on top of that. And so the administrative decision really was that they were already being fined. It is also true that in case of child labor out in the fields, particularly where people are working there in the presence of the parents, and where there does not appear to have been any concerted effort on the part of the employers to recruit and to hire underage people, that we commonly warn first rather than fine. Let me tell you something else about what's going on in the field, because we've had an ongoing discussion with the reporter in the Oregonian who keeps writing about this, and I respect what he's doing, and he covered this issue down in California. California made a decision to really crack down on any kids being out in the fields, even in the company of their parents, because it was believed, I think correctly, that in many of those cases the kids end up working, reporting what they pick on the parents' ticket, they get paid for it, and it's part of the family income. That's against the law. We don't support that. We don't believe in it. But what they did in California was they basically said, if we find kids out there, if we find anybody's working, we're going to fine you very severely. And so most of the fields said, no kids. We're not going to be out here. So when I asked my counterpart down in California, well, where'd the kids go? They said, we don't know. All we know is they're not in the fields, and that's all that we're concerned with. I don't think that's an appropriate response. When we have families that can't afford childcare, and they want to have their kids with them because they're too young to be left alone, and we say to them, if you want to keep working here, you got to get rid of your kids. And we don't know where they go, we don't care what they go. It seems to me that there's at least a high likelihood those kids are going to get involved in activities that are far more detrimental to them than picking illegally. And so we have not taken the position of trying to crack down and drive all the kids from the field. We are trying to work to make sure that the law is enforced. We have substantially strengthened our law as a state since 1989. And the old days when you used to have school buses full of kids going out there in the fields and picking is not happening anymore. But we are continuing. We're trying to be vigilant. We're trying to work with them. But I have refused to take the step of trying to drive the kids completely from the fields until I have some confidence of where they're going to go. Yes.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. I read someplace that business home offices, large but also medium and small in Oregon, have been decreasing. Is it true? Is it good? And can the Bureau do something about it?
By business home office, you mean where you have large companies and they have their main headquarters office here? Small?
I think I read that in downtown Portland, in Portland, there used to be a lot of home-owned businesses, and that this is not so anymore.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the statistics are. I think that what you're saying is probably correct, because what we're seeing today is a lot of consolidations and changes so that there are just fewer almost. I don't think, again, this one is that Oregon can necessarily change that. What we want to do is we want to be able to have a good environment so businesses that start here can grow here and will stay here once they've grown. But we also have to be competitive in terms of where people can locate their businesses. But I think that dynamic of the changing economy is one that has broader national and international implications, and it's one that we're going to be interested in, but there's probably not a lot we can do about.
That's why I said, what can the Bureau do?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Pavel Goberman, a City Club member. Your speech was very smooth as a Secretary of State or a government of state. But you didn't say about your job now as commissioners, Bureau of Labor of Industrials. My point is 2,400 complaints every year about discrimination on workplaces, discrimination and other complaints. Why? 2,400 families suffered from it. You in your department does not do proper job, because if you will punish who violate your Oregon Constitution, it will not happen. Therefore, my point is, I don't think you're a good manager. I don't think you deserve to run for higher office. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Let me say a couple of things. Number one, the complaints are actually lower than that now. They've been going down for several years. Wish I could tell you it's because we're doing a wonderful job of solving all the problems. In fact, I think it's tied a lot to the economy, is that when people are being laid off, being fired, they're more likely to look at, am I being treated fairly, am I being discriminated against? The other thing I tell you about discrimination complaints, and this is true all across the country, the vast majority of complaints end up establishing either have no merit of the complaint or you can't prove the discrimination. That doesn't mean they're all frivolous. In many cases, people are treated unfairly. They're just not discriminated against. It's not illegal. It's important that we have a place like our office where people can come. They don't have to hire a lawyer. They don't have to go to, not that there's anything wrong with lawyers, Les, but they can come to us and get a first look at the case to decide whether they have some merit. Has there been a law? Often someone says, I was laid off. My friends told me they thought I had a complaint. I wanted to come see you. We've tried to streamline the system. We have been working to try to get cases that don't have merit dismissed within the first 30 to 45 days. I think we've done a much better job of managing those. But we're not going to get rid of complaints. What we need to have is a place where people can come. And then many times, once we find there is some basis, they'll withdraw and go to court and probably collect more money that way. And that's, God bless them, that's fine. But we are trying to manage that resource and trying to deal with it. And apparently we don't satisfy all our customers, but we try to do the best we can. Yes, sir.
Marcus Samantel, City Club member, and I think most of us here also hope you leave office on your feet. My question is quick. I came here today really to hear about workers here in Oregon and how they're doing, and I haven't really heard that. How are the workers in Oregon doing compared to before you took office, and how are they doing compared to the rest of the states?
Workers in Oregon are actually doing better overall. Not necessarily because I'm in office, but because our economy has it. We're one of the few states in the union that has increased manufacturing jobs in the 1990s for some of the reasons that I described. And the wage levels have been going up, and incomes of Oregonians have been improving. One disturbing trend, I don't know if you saw recently when they were reporting about the fact that there are 1 million more people across the country who don't have health insurance, but the percentage of the population that's uninsured is about the same nationally. It's gone up in Oregon. And in fact, in Oregon, there are it's a higher percentage of people without health insurance in Oregon than in Washington. And of course, the Oregon Health Plan was supposed to change that. Now, we've had problems getting Washington, D.C. to allow us to operate the health plan the way it was originally intended we want to. But there's some of those things that we still have to deal with. And I think that as a state, we need to be cognizant of the impact that our decisions have on workers and workers' opportunities. I also think that the question of how we educate and prepare the workforce for the future is the critical issue. Because if you look demographically down the road, as those of us who are baby boomers start retiring, and we're going to leave a huge hole, and because the cohort following us is not as large, there are going to be tremendous opportunities. But people need to have the skills and the abilities, because the jobs that used to be available for people who left school and just went out and did manual labor are not going to be there. And so we need to make sure that we're preparing our kids for the opportunities of the future. And the important key there, I think, is that we need to stop telling kids that the world of the future is going to be this cutthroat place where only a few people have good jobs, the rest are left out. We too often give that message, and it's absolutely false. I am convinced there will be opportunities for every young person who takes the time, makes the commitment, not only to get educated, but to acquire the personal skills, the personal qualities that it takes to be successful. The world of the future is going to be very bright for them. The kids that get in trouble, the kids that get disillusioned, the kids that get turned off, the kids that drop out, they are going to have a terrible burden, and they are going to be a burden on the rest of society. And so we need to continue to concentrate on that and build to that for the future. Yes, sir.
We got time for one more question.
Kurt Krause, City Club. My employer was one of those that came here, a Japanese employer who came here in the mid-'80s, looking for cheap land and cheap labor. And a lot of those things have changed since then, but what was endemic to the high-tech industry, of course, is the temporary worker. Recently, Microsoft got in big trouble about hiring people who then didn't distinguish between temporary and permanent workers. What is the state doing, what is your Bureau doing to ensure that such an occurrence doesn't happen here in Oregon?
As far as on the temporary versus permanent, and our responsibilities in that are different than, for example, the Employment Department, which deals with unemployment insurance, Department of Consumer and Business Services that deals with workers' comp. One of the other things I tried unsuccessfully to do was to get all these things put together in one agency, and we've not been able to convince the legislature to do that either. Our main job is making sure that people are paid appropriately, whether they're permanent or temporary, and so that distinction is not significant for us in our enforcement efforts. I do think it's a very important issue, and it's one that we have to deal with in a broader sense as a society, because one of the things that we do is every time we create new mandates and new requirements, the way you have to treat your employees, again, whether it's a distinction between temporary or full-time in any event, is it creates more incentive for people, particularly in industries that are labor intensive, to farm out that responsibility of meeting the requirements, meeting the paperwork, and doing the rest of it. And what happens, of course, in that case is that the money that's being paid by the original employer gets filtered through